In my world there is music and good vibes and laughter and lovers, adventure and friendship. We know who we are.
Welcome to Be the Wellness Podcast, where we help you master your body, mind, and the experience of life through insightful conversation, interviews with experts and thought leaders, all with a side of marital banter and some good old-fashioned humor.
Yes, we are your hosts, Adam and Vanessa Lambert, and we're committed to helping you live life fully expressed physically, mentally, and experientially. Sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and join the conversation.
Hello, everybody. It's Adam and Vanessa.
It sure is. I feel like there should be some like honky-tonk music. Hi, everybody. It's Adam and Vanessa.
Well, we could probably figure that out.
I think, can you do that? Cue the honky-tonk.
Yeah. I have been watching that like history of country music.
Yeah, you have.
It's good. It's really good. I mean, and it's super interesting because it's, I just never really considered like where country music came from because it is such a uniquely American thing for the most part.
It's true.
It's like nobody else really has, like there's not a lot of UK pops or country stars.
Right.
There's the one guy from Australia, right?
Yeah, Australia has kind of a country scene for sure.
Yeah.
And so does Canada, actually.
Well, yeah. Okay, so I should say North American.
North America, yeah.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, like I almost forget that you're a cowboy.
Yeah.
And then you dive into this like country music marathon and I'm like, oh yeah, there's his roots.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we just got to like Hank Williams. You know what I mean? So it's like now it's getting into like the country music that I'm like, oh yeah, no, I know all of these songs, Yeah. It's a trip.
So Adam and I have kind of an ongoing joke about some of the music that he likes because obviously you listen to a lot of country growing up and like a lot of it was sort of this older Hank Williams and what are some of the others?
Well, I think what you're thinking of specifically is Marty Robbins.
Marty Robbins.
Yeah.
So Adam, we're listening to this song one day and Adam's like, oh man, I just forget how good this old country music is. And I'm like, this sounds like a Sesame Street song to me. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
And it's super true. Once she said it, I was listening. I'm like, dude, this is like Sesame Street music, But it's basically, I mean, it comes from like the folk tales, right? So like, that's where all of this stuff comes from. It's like before country music got turned into pop music.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't, now it follows the pop format and framework, right?
Right.
Where before it was telling a story.
Totally.
With a banjo.
Just like Sesame Street.
Exactly. No, it's and I even think about it now. Hank Williams Jr. has a song called the Count song.
I was just thinking of the Count. I was like, one,
Oh yeah. No, you'll have to just, if you don't know it, just YouTube or Spotify or whatever, Hank Williams Jr. the Count song.
Okay.
Yeah, and you'll thoroughly enjoy that.
Yeah, it was pretty funny, but it goes to show like how, those neural pathways are so strong, right? Because if you relate that music to feelings of, whatever positive emotions or positive feelings of like your childhood and growing up and, being out like working on the ranch and doing all of that cowboy stuff that you did.
Yeah.
But it's pretty funny, actually. Yeah.
Well, nostalgia is like one of our favorite emotions, right?
Yes.
Or whatever it is, like experiences, right? Because you can look back on something and just be like,
that's when it was
great.
awesome.
And you're like, and you really think about it. You're like, all right, what was I actually doing? I'm like, man, the stuff I was doing was not that much fun, but like you just remember the time.
Yeah,
so, anyway.
Of course. And it's totally cute, but it was just super funny to like hear obviously we had a completely different filter hearing that. I was like, the only thing I can compare this to is Sesame Street.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty funny stuff. So how's everybody doing out there? Yes, I know. We hear you. Yeah. Times are crazy right now, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, dude. It's, I mean, I'm just going to say it's the craziest time in my life. Certainly that I remember.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like there was some weird shit going on in the early 80s, you know, just like the whole deal, Star Wars and Iran Contra, and you know what I mean? There was like all of this stuff going on. But it was not a worldwide quarantine and lockdown.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like this is just a totally different thing.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, we're definitely being faced with challenges that are really new. And it goes to show that even if things might have been sketchier at times, right? So when you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, or you think about times when we're literally on the edge of not knowing if, you know, life on the planet could be destroyed by, you know, nuclear war.
Assured mutual destruction.
Right, exactly. And it's like somehow, even though that threat remains, that is the threat we're used to now in a way. And it's like, it's funny how we're able to metabolize fear and get used to it. But like now we are facing something that we haven't faced before. And so it's just a really amazing example to me of how we're way more comfortable with the fear we know than the fear that we don't.
Well, yeah. So then there's a couple of things about that, right? So like, you know, in the case of mutually assured destruction, right? You're betting like somewhere in the back of your mind, the probability of that happening is weighted against another human being saying and knowing that if they push that button, that this whole thing comes to an end, and saying fuck it and doing it anyway. Right. So like somewhere back there, you're like, yeah, when it really comes down to it, are you going to get the two guys to turn the keys and push the buttons, man? They know what's coming, right? This we're dealing with is a virus, right? This is like not even a biological life form. This is something that has no, you know, well, depending on how you look at it, I guess, has no consciousness and no ability to decide what it's doing.
Or does it?
Or it's right. You know, that's what I was going to say. Like if you look at the panpsychism idea, maybe it does.
Right.
But it's like a whole different thing. You know, there's no negotiating with a virus, right?
Right.
No diplomacy.
No, it's absolutely true. And I think that, you know, it just goes to show that no matter how, you know, how prepared you are to, you know, for whatever's coming at you, there's always just this sense of feeling more insecure in the face of something that you don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, and so I talk about this book all the time, and I'm still sure probably most of you haven't read it, but in Ernest Becker's Denial of Death, which I just realized the other day, I didn't know this when I first read it, but he actually won a Pulitzer for that book.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I knew it was good.
Yeah.
You know, it's just hard to read.
Yeah.
but it's a good book. But it just lays out, I mean, if you read that book and get a grasp of the psychological sort of human condition behind our fear of death, or how the fear of death is behind the human condition, however you want to look at that. Everything that we're seeing right now and like people's behavior and how all of this stuff goes, it's just sort of like, oh, well, yeah, of course. You know, like if the existential crisis of the human mind is that you know you're going to die and you're not really 100% sure what happens after that, of course you're going to be wigged out. You know what I mean? Like this whole thing's just like, oh my God, you know, and all of a sudden, you know, the veil has been pulled up and you're just find yourself, you know, walking a tightrope over the abyss, you know, and like that can screws with you.
Yeah. You know, it's really interesting because over the last few years, and I've talked about this at, you know, length to people who ever will listen to me, but even on the podcast, about having really amazing experiences and connection with the afterlife through plant medicine, and really feeling like I have a strong connection to what that looks like and the potentiality of like the afterlife. And I will say that after those experiences, like I feel so much less stressed about what happens here. And I think it's really interesting, even over the last couple of years, the more that I've gone into my own spiritual practice and the more that I've really kind of pulled out some of those filters of fear, how like I really am not afraid of death anymore. And in fact, I would go as far to say as like, I'm kind of excited about it. I'm like, ooh, like, I think it's like the final mystery, the final adventure. And I don't know. It's just a really interesting place in the spirit of this coronavirus and kind of looking at everything. And, it's like you have the human side of you that is very much like, well, I don't want to lose the people I love. I don't want to go through the pain or the heartache of that absence, because really that's what it is. It's you preparing for an absence, a space that was occupied in your heart by this person's, of their actual physicality in the world.
So you mean like if somebody dies?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's a lot of what our fears are, right? It's not even necessarily so much about ourselves, but what if it's someone that we really love? Like, I think for me, that is way more scarier than myself. It's like, worrying about the absence of someone that fills a space in my heart and my mind and in my world would be a much more difficult thing to go through than my own death. I'm like, I'm really not afraid of that. But I know that the hardship of going through a loss would be just that. It would be a real hardship. Like you would have to go through that process.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think, I don't know. I don't know what it says about my overall outlook on humanity, but I think like at the end of the day, what you just said is what a lot of people would say. But then when it really comes down to it, and like with some really, like dedicated introspection, and peeling back all of the layers, I would bet that there's a lot of people who are really fundamentally afraid of their own death.
Oh, 100%.
You know what I mean? Like, and I think it's like, it's not this kind of fear of, it would really suck to fall off of a building. You know what I mean? It's like not that kind of a thing. It's just this massive unknown.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I agree. And I think we know people who feel that way and who have expressed that. And I think that, I think it's why there's so much value in having some belief system in some type of afterlife, but you can't manufacture it. It's not like you can just invent it. If you really don't believe it, you don't believe it. But I know for me personally, like in the last few years, it's just become so much less scary, and it's almost just so much less bothersome what happens, because I'm like, in the end, I really just feel that we will all return to oneness, and we will all return to such a beautiful place. And it just makes like the tunnel vision of this moment so much less intense. Yeah. Because you're just like, okay, well, yeah, it would be painful. It would be difficult to grieve a loss of someone that I love. And inevitably in my lifetime, I will experience that, because that is just part of the human cycle. I've already experienced it with my grandparents, with many good friends who I've lost. And so like, there's always that like, oh shoot, is this the moment I'm going to have to walk into that next pain storm? Yeah. But if you zoom out beyond that, I just really believe this is all so temporary, and that our spirits are so everlasting, and that, even though it may seem like this tunnel vision of this lifetime, it's so encompassing and all important. And it is, because this is your lifetime. It's your beautiful experience right now. It should be that way. But it is helpful, I think, sometimes to not feel like this is the only one experience that's ever going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I hope that's the case. Like, and to add a layer to that, not only do I hope that there is some, cosmic pool of consciousness that we're all little drops of, right? And having this experience, but I hope that there's at least like a flash somewhere in the transition where you get it, where you see both sides of the veil for a brief enough second to go, aha, and then you go on to whatever's next, It would just be such bullshit if you just like fell asleep and woke up and the movie was over and you're like, wait, I'm here now? Like, well, I totally missed it. Like, what was the thing?
Yeah,
what did the guy say at the end?
Right.
Like that
what was the punchline?
Shit. Like that would be such a bummer. But, the thing, we talk about like the fear of death and like this as, well, at least when we talk about it, I feel like sometimes it can come across as it's like a burden, right? Like, oh, if you just get rid of this thing, then, now you can live so much more free because you're not worried about that. And I think that there's really some truth to that. At least having like a healthy acceptance that you are a biological carbon-based creature with a life cycle, and this is just how it goes, like that. I think that can be really good. But one of the things, and again, like pointing back to Ernest Becker's review of all of this stuff, one of the things that he talks about is like this, like part of what drives human innovation is this desire to leave something behind, to make your mark here. This is your immortality project, right? So, like, if you think about who's the guy, the Think and Grow Rich guy?
Napoleon Hill.
Not Napoleon Dynamite. Napoleon Hill, right? That was his immortality project, that book, the work that he did. I mean, here we are almost 100 years later, right?
Yeah.
And still his name is commonplace in the house and people read his stuff, right? So without that like innate desire within him to put something into the world that means something and sticks, we wouldn't have that, So I think it's like, it's just all how it's supposed to be.
I agree. And I actually kind of toy with this idea, and I understand that philosophy, and I even understand how appropriate it is for where we are in sort of our karmic cycle as an Earth species. But I actually am curious if it's a potential that we could transcend the fear-based approach, right? Because it's still a fear of like, will I have made any impact on this planet? Will my life have meant anything, or will it have just be forgotten and then I will no longer exist in any way, shape, or form? And it's still this kind of fear that like your life will have not meant anything. But I'm curious if we transcend that and we can create from a place of what impact or what seed am I interested in planting from a space of I am all knowing and all powerful and a master creator. And what is it that I want to impart,
Yeah.
And I think it's a slight difference, but I'm just curious if as a species, we were able to transcend in some way, shape, or form this fear mindset and really get into like the proactive creativity mindset, what would come from that instead? And I mean, I don't know. Like this is the stuff I like to think about.
I mean, and you're right. It is a super subtle shift, right? Because it's at the end of the day, it's the same thing. You're still, okay, I know I'm not going to be here.
Right.
So what can I create that's my contribution to the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, even just framing it like that versus, this, I'm afraid, I know I'm an infinite or I'm a finite thing, and I'm afraid that I will have been a, splash in the bucket or whatever, drop in the bucket. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you're creating from the fear of your mortality. And I just know for me personally, like it has been such a shift to create from a place of like being in awareness and acknowledgement of my beautiful source energy and like understanding that I am a divine creator in my own right. And what do I want to do with this beautiful gift I've been given?
Yeah.
Rather than, scrapping for like the next set, trying to figure out just how to like make sense of it all and how to just not be so terrified of it all.
Right.
And I think that, I really do believe what's happening in the micro, it is a reflection of what's happening in the macro. And so if I'm experiencing that in my own microcosm of humanness, of feeling the difference and how beautiful and liberating it is to come from that place, like what would that look like on the macro? And I do actually believe that we are transcending into a new state of being. And it's why spirituality and all of this, esoteric kind of energy is so prevalent right now, is that I do think people are tired of living in fear. I think we're ready to transcend that old paradigm. And I do think that we might see, in this next decade, 2 decades, millennium of like a new creation of how we put forth our energy and what we create in acknowledgement of being such divine creators ourselves.
That's a lot of, okay. Wrap that wrap that up for me in a smaller package.
Okay. So instead of creating from a place of fear that we're afraid of losing this life that we have.
Yeah.
Quite simply, that we acknowledge that our life is finite, but that our creativity is infinite. And what do we do with that source energy? Rather than, creating in the shadow of fear, how do we create in the spark of empowered,
not fear.
Being empowered with being amazing source beings. Yeah.
So what do you do to bring that about in your own life?
Well, I mean, I truly believe it's important to cultivate an arsenal of tools in order to navigate your life with. It's like people, if you're finding yourself reactionary to what is happening in life, then it's just you haven't cultivated a way to interact with the planet and with life and with Earth that doesn't leave you feeling disempowered. You just haven't got the education yet.
Right.
And so it's actually always really sad for me to see people living in that state of being where they're just still in the grind of, fear and, feelings of lack and feelings of hopelessness. And although I do think they're super important for the trajectory and how I think Anahata used the term the dark night of the self or the dark night of the soul.
Dark night of the soul, yeah.
The dark night of the soul. I really like that. We all have that. We all have to go through that hero's journey, right? Where we go and we face our inner demons and we see what it feels like to live in that darkness and to be in that shadow self. But eventually it is your soul's plan to outgrow that, to overcome that, to find the duality, to find the lightness of being. And the way to do that is by finding the tools that get you there, by healing what needs to be healed, by forgiving the unforgivable, by really getting complete with the shadow self.
This is all the work of the middle ground. So we were watching a show last night. I don't remember what it was called, but they had all of these people segregated by age. It was 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Right.
And they had them doing various tasks, like a whole Olympics of bullshit. And at the end, the two age groups who were most successful were the 20-year-olds and the 60-year-olds.
Yes.
And they made this point, or actually, I think it was like a behavioral psychologist that was talking about why they saw these results. And there's essentially a U-shaped curve. And if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you are at the intellectual bottom of this U-shaped curve, and it totally makes sense once they explained it. Like when you're in your 20s, you don't know much, right? You don't have a lot of life experience, but you have a very well-oiled machine of a brain.
Right.
Everything works really well. High processing speed. Everything's new and interesting. And you're not, crammed into some paradigms. You're open to new ideas and you're creative. And there's all of this stuff happening when you're in your 20s.
Yeah.
And then when you're in your 60s, they have, I think, what they call crystallized intelligence, which is essentially wisdom, right? It's everything you've gathered. It's the slides in the tray. You're like, oh, I've been here before.
Yeah.
And those are somewhere similar and I know how to deal with this. And it's so interesting to think about just being in the middle at the bottom of that curve. Like, fuck, man, I just can't think about this. And I've never seen it before. I don't know what the hell to do, and this is really, it's just fascinating to think that you can spend, 3/4 of your life. No, that wouldn't be right.
30 years.
2/3.
So,
yeah. 2/3 or whatever of your life in the suck of it, what I mean? In the bottom of the curve, grinding it out, and it's such a trip.
But I would argue that has just become the default setting of the way that we have created it so far, because what happens is in your 30s, so 30s, 40s, and 50s, most people are in the thick of their career. They're in the thick of raising families. They're in the thick of it, right? Whatever they have set out to do, they're in the thick of it, and they're weighted down by those things that they've chosen. chosen rather than uplifted by those things they've chosen. And that just is because of the way that we happen to have created the paradigm so far, is that the things that we want to create in our life cause us more hardship. And although they are great investments for the latter days, much of the time during that actual investment is quite difficult. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of joy in raising a family, and there's a lot of joy in, you know, in choosing a career and having that. But there's allegedly, but there's just also a lot of weight to it. There's a lot of strain and pressure. And, you know, especially these days, people are more pressurized in that particular part of their life than ever. And I just think that that's just another reason why this coronavirus and where we are right now is a really interesting period of decompression for the entire world. Like, we've been so pressurized to create, to be productive, to be going, that there's literally been zero room, and I would almost even argue tolerance for space, for literally having space for your human experience. And I find it really, really interesting that, you know, you talked about the virus not having a consciousness, but I do think that Mother Nature is so intelligent. And so she has her own consciousness. She has a way of creating balance. And she's so far beyond us that we could never understand how intelligent she is. And I think it's one of the things, again, just spending time with plant medicine and just getting even a small glimpse of the power and intelligence of one or two plants. You know, imagine the collective consciousness of plants who've been on the planet for literally billions of years. Like, we just can't even fathom what that intelligence is. So to me, this idea that the coronavirus doesn't have an intelligence, or at least something underneath it, is, I just think it's probably, for me, it feels untrue. It feels like there is some sense of Mother Nature trying to install some kind of balance again. And giving us all room to have a little decompression. You know? Collectively. And I know you parents at home that are like homeschooling your kids right now and working your online job are like, what are you talking about?
What is this space that you're talking about?
And so, and it's actually a really good point that I think needs to be addressed. In the eye of that, though, you that are dealing with the complexity of that are also probably being forced to reevaluate a lot of the systems and a lot of the way that your life is set up. And probably already thinking, okay, how can I make things more simple? How can I decompress the situation? Because this isn't sustainable. And I would probably argue that it wasn't sustainable before either. It's just being turned, the volume's being turned all the way up now. So you have no choice but to confront what is there and how to create less pressure in your life. And so it's so facto, kind of going back, it is depressurizing your life in a way, because it's forcing you to have to look that energy in the face and figure out what to do.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to push things all the way to the point of failure. Right? Yes. That's the thing about, it's the thing about the status quo in general, right? It's like there's, I don't know how to talk about this, but so I just read 0 to 1, which was
the Amazon.
No, not Amazon. It's the guy, the other guy, the PayPal guy. He founded PayPal with Elon Musk and those guys, and he don't remember his name.
I thought it was the Amazon owner. What's his name?
Bezos.
Yeah, it's not.
No, it's the other guy.
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, 0 to 1 is this book about, entrepreneurs and how to get from 0 to 1. Like it's the beginning of all of this. And so what they did, and it's a fascinating book, really. And even if you're not an entrepreneur, specifically even a tech entrepreneur, it's interesting to read because it really is just like a study of human behavior from like a decision-making perspective, And so one of the things that they did is they're like analyzing all of these super successful businesses, and been by successful, meaning that they were able to get from 0 to 1, right? So it's not even just like Facebook and Amazon, right? They're looking at all of these different companies, and they kind of came up with some principles, like these things that all of these guys do the same, because they all did it differently, but there's some factors or some sort of principles or whatever that go along with it. And one of the kind of underlying themes is doing everything within your power, within the organization's power, to stave off the status quo. Because once people are comfortable, then their primary goal in life is to maintain that comfort, as opposed to continuing to grow, continuing to innovate, continuing to move the ball down the road. Decisions, like even at the board level, right? So you talk about like compensation for the CEO. If it is over X amount of money, then their primary directive is going to be to maintain that position so that they can maintain that money, not, bring everybody else along or whatever, the kind of greater good of the company would be, right? And I think it's really interesting to look at that just in the framework of overall life. It's like, it's like you said forever, when you're green, you grow, and you ripe, you rot, right? And it's like, that just is how it is. If as soon as the comfort sets in, that's where you're going to stay.
Absolutely.
It's such a small percentage of people who will continue to push the rock up the hill, even though they've met all of their, sort of quote unquote comfort needs, standards, whatever it is, and great for those people, like awesome, but that's not most people, and I think that it can be really helpful to sort of recognize that about yourself, right? That like comfort and complacency and contentment and all of those things hover in the same sort of Venn diagram, which contentment, I would say, is like a really positive thing, right? You feel good about where you are, but personally, but what is the role you're filling in the world? It's like, if you're content to be doing what you're doing, are you actually fulfilling your role in the world to bring forward something new and interesting and, really contribute,
And I would even argue that you're actually not content when you're content. I mean, I would actually argue that like this idea that you're going to get over there to the place where everything is finally okay is really a big mirage, because you even look at it in the statistics of people who retire and they, work their whole life, and I'm putting my money away and I'm going to save and I'm going to retire. And then they die 5 years later. Totally. Because like what people actually realize is that you thrive in that growth mentality, in that growth, in that striving for something. And again, staying green, staying interactive with your world. As soon as you become stagnant, there's nothing more that your energetic being is thriving on. And so unless your retirement is filled with amazing, creative, new challenges and things that like bring another, forefront of that kind of energy generation, right. I would argue that people think that they're trying to get somewhere that when they finally get there is actually, again, like the place that you rot. You like, this is why it's so important that we accept how important it is to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Yeah. Because like this is the way of Earth. This is the way of nature. And as soon as something is fully expressed, it dies. And so that's fine. Because again, like we're all going to die. We're all going to get there. But if your goal is to stay interactive and in the vibrancy and the vibrational frequency of like vitality, then getting comfortable shouldn't necessarily be the goal. Yeah. Like, yeah, there can be benchmarks along the way that make life, more enjoyable or more interesting or more creative. But just to like always be striving to get to the place where you can give up, like, okay, now I don't have to try anymore. Like, I just think it's a false hope.
Well, maybe. I know that's true for you. Like that, I just know you well enough to know that like that is the thing, right? It's like you have a new idea every 15 seconds, right? And so it's like this thing of always achieving and thinking and iterating, and like that's just kind of how you do it. But like, let's talk about like a Buddhist monk, right? Like where their entire mission is non-attachment and to reduce suffering.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so they achieve that. So let's say it takes them 40 years, right? 40 years of Zen to get to this point of non-attachment and reduction, absolute reduction of suffering. Well, what are they contributing to the world? You know what I mean? Like,
I would
what is
argue
it that they're actually, are they being useful as a human on this planet?
100%, because they're holding the frequency of compassion. They're holding the frequency of non-attachment, and they're holding the frequency of like that energy that makes a contribution to the world. And so you are measuring contribution based on like some kind of measurable output, but it might, I mean, and I don't know, obviously I'm not a Buddhist monk, but the way that I would see it is that they are in that process of growing and creating and expanding that vibrational frequency of which they are trying to attune to. And so like there is within the micro of their, cosmic universe, they are in their own expansion and in their own process. Because like you may be a Buddhist monk, but I can guarantee from the first day that you go into the monastery to, 30 years, you are going to have attuned to even deeper understanding and frequency of compassion or whatever that energy is that you're trying to create and trying to hold for the world. And so like that is a process. That is a growth mindset, even though it may be really hard for us to measure.
No, I totally understand that it's their own internal process. But so what you're saying is that their contribution to the world is like 5G of compassion, right?
Yeah.
So they're spreading a network of compassion or vibe for the world.
100%, they're contributing a super important frequency to the collective consciousness. And I believe that there are people who are assigned to hold the frequency to help pull us into higher and higher divinity. And those people feel that in their hearts. And I think that's why they step into that training, because there are the spiritual guides of the planet that are helping us as a species and as a frequency to attune higher and higher.
So then on that, so if that's the case, and there's this, this network of consciousness vibration at a certain level that's emanating from these places. And it's not just obviously Tibet, right? But there's lots of people that are doing this kind of work.
Totally.
Then where does the person that you described in the beginning fit in that, right? So the person who is, green and growing, where do they fit in that? Is that something that they're ascending towards? Is that something that they are creating the balance of? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
If like this contentment and stillness and compassion and lack of desire is a frequency emanating from Tibet, and this drive and motivation and achievement is a frequency emanating from Silicon Valley. Are they, you know what I mean? Are these things, is this a yin yang scenario?
Well, I don't know if it's a yin yang scenario. The first thing that occurs to me is that neither one is good or bad. And that each soul has its own journey within that frequency to learn whatever it has to learn in its soul's journey. And so like, I mean, I don't think that necessarily, it feels to me like you're trying to put it on this linear path where like the Buddhist monks are like way, way further along in their process. And maybe they are in a certain way, but I don't think we're necessarily like all on the same continuum.
Right.
I think that each soul might have its own soul's journey. So like this lifetime, I might be learning how to live more compassionately. I might be trying to understand the duality of compassion. And on the flip side, maybe understanding suffering as well. And like that might be my soul's journey this time around, to really have the education on those particular subjects, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Another soul might be, on a journey of selflessness, you know what I mean? And therefore maybe attracting people into their lives that are really selfish, and they're working with the duality of those particular contexts. So like, I don't necessarily think that one is better than the other, or one is, or that they are connected in a sense, but I don't think that like they necessarily all have to be on the same continuum, if that makes sense.
So they don't, I mean, what I was kind of getting at is if they're a balancing force, and what you're saying is that it's not that simple. Huh?
Well, I mean,
it's not a teeter-totter.
Yeah, I don't pretend to understand the whole like concept of collective consciousness, but I do believe that the overall goal, I think, should be and is on some higher level to keep pulling the bottom up, right? So like, we always hear about people saying like, oh, she's an old soul, or like, you can just tell he's an old soul, or, like we have this idea about
people you hang out with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've all heard that term. And I think what people are referring to is that person seems a little further along in their knowing and their understanding. Right. And there's a sense of like attunement about them.
Like wise beyond their years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that all of us, probably have had multiple lifetimes, but maybe some of us are newer in our learning. And it's kind of like some people might still be in grade school, right, and some people might, be getting like double doctorates by now because they've done the prerequisite work, so to speak, to graduate and to move up the hierarchy of learning. And so, as you get into the hierarchy and sort of become a master in a way, that is when you become a teacher, right? Like, mm-hmm. And many times I think that's why people are called forward to be teachers, is that they have reached a certain level of attunement or mastery. And it's now time for them to move sort of into the teaching end of it. And we all are just wherever we are in our cycle, and it's all perfect and beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. All of that, like it makes sense when you talk about it, right? But the thing that I come up against is that it makes sense because of the framework of hierarchy, mm-hmm. and maybe moral framework, mm-hmm. Or moral, well, I mean, we have a sense that there are things that are better, like, oh, that's better than this, right? That there's positives and negatives to ways of being, and that there is some higher level to be achieved, meaning that it's good,
right, and
that we should do that.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that I still just have not been able to wrap my head around is in what context should we be describing good and bad? Under what circumstance do we get to decide that the universe has levels of which we should try to ascend? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, where does that even come from? It's such a like, in my mind, such a base human ego concept that I find it really hard to believe that that's actually what the fuck is going on.
No, I totally agree. And I've thought about this a lot. And I think that actually it comes from our human context of trying to make things good and bad. And I think that that's just part of our human experience, right?
Yeah.
But part of that is duality, right? And duality is that in order to experience something, there has to be like the contrast of it, right? And so one of the questions that people have asked is like, so Kim, for instance, when we were at Rhythmia, and she was asking, does a negative thought have to exist in order for a positive one to exist, right? And so I don't know when we're in spirit if that is true still, but I think in our human experience, it is true for us, is that we thrive in duality and that we understand through duality, and that it's really difficult for us to understand without a comparison, right? Like it's hard for us to recognize a frequency if we can't see how it's different from something else.
Right.
And I don't actually think that it's right or better or whatever, but I do think that there's an energetic experience that goes along with those things. And so we as humans tend to feel better and tend to have a higher frequency or experience of our vibration when we are in these levels that are more in the lightness, right? Like where you would say, you know, a dark experience would be selfishness and a light being would be selflessness or whatever. Like whatever that context is, we tend to feel a better frequency when we are trending towards the light. But I would actually say that we feel the best when we are in acceptance of the balance. You know what I'm saying? Like when we can see the duality and we can accept both sides of it and we can experience ourselves in that acceptance. We may decide to express more in the light, but like there comes a point where, you know, like the example I just gave about selflessness, like you could be so selfless that now it's darkness again because you're allowing everybody to take from you and you're not like protective of your own source energy. So like anything, if you let the pendulum swing too far, starts to just be a circular reference where now it's going back into the other side. So like we find our best experience, I think, in the recognition of the duality and in the idea that we get to choose where in that continuum we are expressing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it does. I just like, it doesn't actually answer any questions. You know what I mean? Like, but I think that's kind of the thing. And like, this is what Graham Hancock, you know, I think expertly refers back to in this stuff is like, how shitty would it be if we had the answers?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if this question wasn't hanging, if it wasn't just out there, you know, then we wouldn't be trying to solve it. And what would we be doing?
No, I will tell you that I had this LSD trip that really, really made a huge impact on me. And the trip was all about the staunch realization that we are truly infinite beings. And that we truly do know everything, like on some level, on some side, we know everything. And it was actually more disturbing to me to realize that like this never actually ends. You never actually get to tap out of the experience of being. Mm-hmm. Like you don't actually ever get to end it. You know, like people think about like,
yeah, you're always going to be.
You're always going to be. And I know that sounds really crazy, but it was like one of the most rattling psychedelic experiences of my life because I was like, oh my God, you can never escape this thing. Yeah. Like it goes on and on and on forever.
Yeah.
And it was really, really stressful because I all of a sudden was faced with the fact that it was so boring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was so incredibly boring and there was nothing to look forward to.
Right.
And it was like this really upsetting, depressing experience that I had. And so it just really clued me into how important it is to forget and to not know, and how beautiful a gift that is to wonder and to like think about it and talk about it and strive for new understandings and to be in that experience, because all we actually are is a pendulum swinging from light to dark, you know, like, and I really look, if you look at the history of mankind, there are the dark ages, because that was where the souls were all experiencing what had to be experienced in that time. And from that, they started emerging, you know, to a different part of the continuum. And I do think we're starting to express towards a light age, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we're just going to swing back again. Like it's just going to.
Well, so this is the thing that I think is interesting about that. So I like the pendulum. I like the pendulum, but the way that it's the exact same thing, but it's just the way that I think about it. So it might be helpful for somebody else, is that it's an oscillation, right? So as opposed to, because for a pendulum to exist, there's a fixed point that it swings from, right?
Totally.
And an energy wave or an oscillation is just that, right? So it's a sine wave, and I think about that, all right. And so if the dark ages, which I think like we can kind of collectively say was like a pretty shit time, right? Like there was like in recorded history, there was a lot of just really unfortunate stuff going on. So if we call that a trough, right? Like that's the bottom end of the wave. We don't really know what was the light time before the dark ages, right? We don't know. Like, are we 3/4 of the way up the hill?
Right.
You know what I mean? From the dark ages? Or are we like peaking right now and about to get in? It's about to get real weird. You know? Like what's going on? You know?
And will
so
the
trippy.
dark be a different kind of dark than it was before? And like we don't.
It'll just be a shade. Like
Well, but this is what I think is really has been super helpful for me and is exciting to think about is that we are in enough of a light age.
Right.
Whether it's the peak or whether it's like still in the shadows, we're in enough of the light age where we can claim it as ours. We can claim that this is a light age for myself. Like I am going to
as good as it's going to get.
Exactly.
While I'm here. Yeah.
I'm going to invent it and create it for myself that way because it's enough available to us that we can do that. And so for me, it becomes like, well, amazing. So if I claim it now as a light age and I create my life as if it is so, what do I want to create? And all of a sudden it becomes so exciting because you have an opportunity to live a beautiful expression. And like, how do you want to make it beautiful? How do you what is it that, your light source inside of you gets so ignited around that you want to put your energy into it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really cool way to look at it because then you're not so you're not so stuck in the contemplation of like, well, is it actually like, are we really happier now than we were 40 years ago? Or like, is this really a good time or is it going to get better or worse?
Or are they kidding?
Yeah, exactly. And you're like, well, it doesn't really matter because you get to claim it as whatever you want to claim it as.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, thoughts from the coronavirus.
I know. Well, it's cool. I mean, we haven't like rapped about stuff in a while on the podcast, So
it is cool.
All right. So I want to talk about one other thing.
Yeah.
And I'm a what is this? Disclaimer is the word for this. I know just enough about this to ask a question, but not even close to enough to like come to any real answers. But so this will be interesting. I suggest you Google it. So this idea of panpsychism, which is, and this is, I'm going to just bastardize and paraphrase what panpsychism is, but it's this idea in the world of talking about consciousness that every single thing down to subatomic particles has a smidgen of consciousness. And so as a molecule, organism, thing becomes more and more complex, right? Having more and more of these tiny smidgens of consciousness, it coalesces into what we would consider consciousness, right? So us being conscious beings, the cat over there having some amount of consciousness based on its overall complexity of subatomic particles, right? The table has some amount of consciousness, a rock, right? So there's this idea of panpsychism versus the more mainstream thought around consciousness right now is that all consciousness is the emergent property of an incredibly complex synaptic shitstorm that's a brain, right? And so once you get to a certain amount of neurons and a certain amount of complexity with electrical activity, consciousness emerges. So it might seem like you're splitting hairs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's really not, So in this form, a rock doesn't have gray matter. There's no electrical activity. There's no consciousness in that rock, right?
Right.
But in panpsychism, there would be. It's just not complex enough to actually be what we would consider sentient, right?
Right. And which do you think it is?
I just don't know. I really just don't know, but what I'm struck with is that the way that the people that know about this shit, right? the neuroscientists of the world, the way that they talk about it is you are not considered a serious scientist if you even consider panpsychism, right? And it's much the same way that we used to think that the sun or that the sun orbited the earth, right? Instead of the opposite, right? Like we just didn't understand. And we was like, nope, that's not how it works. And you're a complete idiot. Now we're like, oh, of course that's how it was, And so what I'm left with is if the idea of panpsychism had emerged first, instead of this idea that I think to some degree came to us through revelation, right? This idea that, you have to be animated by a force from God. And that's where your consciousness comes from, right?
Right.
If we didn't have that, right? And we were left to work our way through the sort of other thought processes and philosophies around this, like in Japanese tradition, right? The kama, right? So was the energy or the life force of all of the natural world around you, which is a lot more like panpsychism, right? It's this idea that rock is a thing. It's a part of this world. It has a spirit, right? The river has a spirit. The forest has a spirit, right? Like that was the direction that we were headed as a world. Everybody had multiple gods, multiple, ways of interacting with nature, right? And like that is sort of like panpsychism to some degree, in the same way that you being animated by a soul given to you, created in God's image or whatever, is like this emergent property of complexity that we call consciousness now, right? So what if we had continued down that path and panpsychism emerged first? Would it seem equally as crazy for scientists now to be saying, shit, you know what? I think this consciousness thing is just being created in our brains. I think that this is manifest once we reach this complexity of electrical activity in gray matter. People would be like, what? You are crazy. You know what I mean?
But what if, okay, so a couple of things that have come to me. What if consciousness doesn't actually have to do with complexity, but that consciousness becomes more complex as like the structures become more complex?
Well, so that's panpsychism.
Yeah.
That's the idea there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have not read about panpsychism, but I think there's a couple of things. Like, one, this idea of like being animated by God, and that like for some reason that was only the only evidence of that is to see human life, just seems to me very strange. It's like, well, who animated everything else? Who animated the rocks? Who animated the sea? Like somebody just like it. There seems to be like a weird distinction there. That's like, okay, so God animated humans, but what about the rest of it? Like, okay, God is the creator of the rest of it, but he didn't animate it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, plants are living and like even rocks and minerals have living organisms. Like they're not dead. Right. So it's, I don't know, to me.
Yeah. So, okay. So, and I'm not a theologian, but this is my understanding of that argument is that, so God animated everything because he created it. Right. But they're all more or less here to serve us, who we were created in the image of God and bestowed with a soul, that's here to be put on trial, essentially, like one way or the other. Right. So it puts us, and I mean, and this, we still see this played out today, is this separation of the human from the rest of Earth, that Earth is our dominion. As opposed to the biological life cycle that we are in, and so I think that's the disconnect there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny because I haven't really read the Bible much, but like obviously we all have these sort of interpretations about what it means or what people have said, and we kind of like have this little backlog of what we think it means, or and like you talking about Earth being the dominion of man, and in one way I think, well, yeah, because we have become complex enough that we sort of, if you look at complexity as the hierarchy, like we have become complex enough that we kind of know how to rule over things through like the mastery of ourself. We kind of know how to manipulate and work in the world to kind of do whatever we want with the real world. Right.
Yeah.
So if you think about it that way, you're like, well, yeah, we kind of are. We do have dominion in a way.
For sure.
But like this idea of it being a test, I think is kind of interesting in the way that where I get stuck with the whole religion thing is that often it feels like you're on trial. right?
Yeah.
It feels like you're on trial and you're either going to go to jail or you're going to be a free person. And it kind of feels like that energy. But for me, it feels more like a university.
Mm-hmm.
Like the test may be, that you're coming here to Earth to learn, like I was saying earlier, learn those certain lessons that were the classes you decided to take this time around. And I think that this idea of like the bad or the good, or like you're going to get in trouble if you do it wrong, you're going to like get, a bad grade and go to jail or whatever it is.
Right. Your heart's going to get eaten by a weird alligator lion creature.
Like that stuff all just feels man-made to me. Like that just feels like that all came from men trying to dominate other men's minds.
Yeah.
And trying to say like, and have some kind of fear tactic, because that's really the only thing that would work. Right.
Right.
So, I mean, to me, I just feel like it all just seems a little silly at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And so but it's that overall feeling, to take this all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Like it's that overall feeling that makes me question this idea of graduating frequency levels.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And bumping up. It feels equally man-made for the same reasons that you just described. You're like, I just don't know. Like I don't know. It seems contrived, and not that it's a bad thing, right? So like if whatever it takes for people to get through a day being a functioning member and being kind to the people around them and to themselves, whatever it takes, what I mean, to get that done, like I'm all for. But what worries me is, and maybe this doesn't even happen, I don't know, like what would freak me out about following some conceptual idea of graduation, without really being sure that it exists, is that you could spend a lot of time chasing shit that doesn't matter. And it puts you in a position that we've just seen throughout history, that if you don't fully understand it, right? Like, so there's this graduation process, and by the end, you're supposed to be a senior, Yeah. If you don't know what each of those things actually means and what the real context of internal growth to reach that point is, then you become subject to the person or the entity or the whatever that is laying the framework for that school.
Yeah.
And most importantly, you become subject to the us and them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm on this path. This is the path. I'm so right about this path that I'll kill you and all of the people like you because you don't agree with my path. And that's just where this shit leads. Like we've seen it over and over and over and over and over. And interestingly enough, probably the most high kill count ruler ever, right? Genghis Khan had the most open policy when it came to religion and these things. He conquered Asia, you know what I mean? And was like on his way to Rome and Western Europe, you know what I mean? Like that, it was happening. They were in Baghdad. They were making a push across that entire continent. And their whole thing, when they get to a certain place, was this, what Dan Carlin called celestial insurance, right? And he was like, roll in there. He's like, hey, you guys pray to whatever gods you want. As long as you pray for me to your God, we're cool. That was his deal. Cause he's like, shit, I don't know. There's a lot of, I've conquered lots of different, all of these different things, and they've all had different religions and shit. Who am I to say which one's right? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think the takeaway there is that you should avoid people who say my way is the only way.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Because like, that's just, again, like this another controlling path. And I think that you should I am always weary of any person who is absolutely sure about anything.
Yeah, totally.
True. And I mean, this is the first thing that I have come, the more I know, the more I recognize that I may have a different discovery in 2 years or 5 years or whatever, that flies in the face of what I thought I knew.
Totally.
And every person that you're learning from should leave room for that.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not leaving room for that, then I'm always really suspicious. And this is why I actually loathe scientists so much, because they're so sure. And so, like you were just talking about how I mean, not
Some
all
of
of them,
them,
not all
yeah.
of them, but how you were saying like, well, no scientist would be taken seriously if he even would consider panpsychism as a thing. And
Right.
it's like, that is just always to me like the biggest red flag is like you just have no idea. If there's anything that history has shown us is that we only know what we know right now, and that like what we know 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 5 minutes from now might be shed a completely different light or
Totally.
filter on what we
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. And I mean, to play devil's advocate on that, though, it's like change has to become as it's borne out by science and through the scientific method, and I completely agree. Like there's the
Well, only because we
siloing.
haven't invented a better way yet.
Yeah. But this is the one that we're dealing with,
Yeah.
right? So it's like this is the best way that we know how current. But I think the thing that we run into with the sciences, and especially when you really get down to like the academic level where things are studying, is like this siloing of specialties, right? So you're not going to get like I think that's stymieing our progress towards a better understanding of a lot of things, is that the people are so specialized and there's not a lot of sharing of information between specialties.
Yeah.
That, if you were to get an aggregator, and like this is what like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock and like a bunch of people, and mostly journalists, right? Because they have the intellect to be able to read and research and understand broad spectrums of things and then put it together into something that's interesting and palatable. But that's what they're doing, right? They're looking across all of these crazy, wildly specific experts, like I know everything there is to know about Turkey from, 12,500 years ago until today. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then comparing that with somebody that knows everything about, the western portion of Java, you know what I mean? And they're taking all of that information and turning it into this bigger picture. I don't know.
Well, I just have a feeling like the more we learn, the more we'll realize it's a lot like the conclusions we've come to in the wellness world, which is that might be true for you.
Yeah.
And then it may not be true for someone else. And that like to actually distill out these universal truths are probably more difficult than we want it to be. And that's why science works so slowly, because it's really hard to prove that this is for sure the truth, because so many things can thwart that truth by, obviously they're trying to control inputs and control all of the things as minutely as they can. But like life isn't like that. Like, even if you prove, with some kind of, with some kind of specificity that something is true for this specific case, like it could just, even if you just think about, a cure for cancer or whatever, it's like, well, yeah, it's for this particular kind of cancer, if these particular things are present and if it's in this particular stage, and then sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's just like what I think, hopefully we get to the point where there's a new distillation process for validation. And I don't really know how will that look. And I think this is where artificial intelligence will offer something really interesting, because it will be able to, it'll be able to understand information on such a greater level than we are through our like minute little processes. Yeah. But then we might cease to exist. But so I don't know.
I mean, that's possible. But I think so. The thing that I think though is that, and I think this is actually, I mean, we've been talking about this for quite a while, but I want to at least bring this point around, because I think this is something that, well, this comes up a lot in you and I's conversations about things, right? So like we're talking about very specific instances and then making inferences to really large and sort of broad things, which is fun for conversation, but it can be problematic when it comes to like, actually understanding that the way that the world works, right? And so it's like when you talk about cancer, right? And so we're like, yes, okay, there's a lot of different things about cancer. We're learning more and more and more as new tools become available, and earlier detection and better understanding of how mitochondria work and like all of this stuff, right? As we learn more about the biology of the human body and all of the things that affect the biology of the human body, it's a wild world, right? We're just learning stuff constantly. But just because the science isn't hard and clear cut there doesn't mean that the science of the universe isn't really very, very well understood right? So much so that we can create proofs mathematically about the world around us, right?
Yeah.
And so like, and there's a real difference there, right? These are different things, and scientists that are saying, no, man, we can like predict now when the universe as we know it will cease to exist mathematically, right? And we can predict the mechanism for which that's going to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And we can prove it mathematically over and over and over from all of these different directions, you know? Like that's pretty damn good science, right? You're like, this is pretty damn good. Now you backpedal a little ways to the guys that are talking about consciousness. We understand the fundamental workings of the universe from a physics perspective. And so we can look at consciousness from that framework and say, does this model of consciousness fit into our current understanding of physics and the universe? Yes or no? You know, and so that's where now we have this variability, right? Where the sort of mainstream, you know, thinkers on consciousness say, well, this fits into our understanding of how this would work. And the panpsychism idea, they're saying, doesn't fit quite as well. But the guys that likes panpsychism are like, well, no, I think if you look at it like this. So they're taking these two ideas and fitting them into the current framework of physics and math that in their opinions are plausible, right? So now we've introduced like the first room for opinion, right? In this whole thing, and orders of magnitude of decisions down the road later, here we are back in the cancer ward where now there's a million different opinions about how this one particular thing works because this shit's just complex. You know what I mean? Like this whole thing is really damn complex, but you can't throw out the truths that have been discerned for now by the scientific method, you know, just because there's question and confusion about our interpretation of some level of it, like in the macro, you know? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess this might be an interesting way to wrap this whole thing up. And you tell me if it feels good to kind of like put a button on it with this, is that what you seek, you shall find. And in the end, if there's anything that we have seen is that when someone is looking for something, typically they can find it.
Yeah.
And if they haven't found it yet and they keep looking, inevitably they find it. And I just think that if we're going to like rest on one sort of principle, it's that if someone is looking for it, whether that be you, whether it be scientists, whether it be whoever, that eventually they seem to be able to find a way that this thing can be true. And the complexity comes when one person is looking for it one thing and another person is looking for it another way. And like, I think that in the end, the one that looks harder is the one who finds it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So two caveats to that so far, like that I can think of. One is Bigfoot. Right. A lot of people have been looking for Bigfoot for a long time and haven't found it.
Or have they? Do you know this?
Well, I mean, it seems it would be, so what, like is the mainstream media is keeping us.
But I mean, aren't there people out there who say they've seen Bigfoot?
For sure, but they haven't, but we don't have. Okay. And so then this comes back to the thing. What is the actual proof? Like, what would we accept as proof of something being found?
I mean, if someone saw it, then they found it. And they went looking for it and they saw it. So they found it.
In their individual experience,
they found it. And this is the whole thing about reality is that like, we all are creators. We are all creating our own reality. And like whatever you're looking for, you're going to probably find if you look hard enough. So decide what you're looking for.
Well, no, that's true. Definitely decide what you're looking for because you probably will find that. But I can't let this go.
Okay.
So the thing is, because I'm actually with that, like I think that is, I actually agree with that because in reality, so we're talking about Bigfoot, right? We know that like from a physiological perspective, your body really can't tell the difference between a dream and waking reality, right? If you saw Bigfoot, you fucking saw Bigfoot. Like, you know what I mean? In your reality, that exists.
Totally.
However, how do we translate that into sixth grade biology class when we're talking about primates and the jump from primates to humans? Can we say that Bigfoot exists when we're teaching people about that?
No, I don't necessarily know if we, like, I think here's the thing. Like, we can say we don't have physical proof that this exists. What we have are people who believe it exists. And for them, they have said it exists. And so possibility it exists is there.
Yeah.
And I think we can say that, like, you know, there's not always going to be tangible evidence for everything that we're looking for. And especially in an esoteric sense or in a spiritual sense or in many ways.
Well, certainly in a spiritual sense, but in like a physical reality sense. Because this is the thing that I always come back up against. And I think Neil deGrasse Tyson did a good job of explaining it. I listened to him talk about this, I don't know, maybe on Joe Rogan or something. And he was saying, you know, it's all well and good to have all of these ideas and all of this stuff until it comes time to teach and make policy about the way that the world works, you know, and I think that that's important, you know.
It is important.
But maybe the solution is to really teach something along the lines of like Bayesian reasoning, right? Where it's like everything is, there's no yes and no. It's just a matter of probabilities.
Yes.
So is it possible that Bigfoot exists? Yeah, sure. What's the probability? 765 billion to 1. But it's possible. You know what I mean? And maybe that's really the direction we need to go with some of this stuff.
I think 100%. And I think that that's where, you know, I think because it is difficult, it's a difficult endeavor to create space, to leave space for things, because we want at some point to draw a line and say like, okay, we know this is how it should be because we proved it and this is how it is. End of conversation. Like, right? People really long for that end of conversation. And I think what we just have to accept is that there's no end of conversation.
Yeah.
It's just, this is what we know right now. This is us making the best decision based on what is available to us in this moment. But imagine how awesome it would be instead of teaching science in this really rigid way where like we kind of curtail possibility, where we taught everything open-ended. And it was like, well, this is how we understand it currently. And we gave more lateral, reasoning for people to say like, especially for kids who are just these amazing incubation machines and like amazing creators. They don't have all the filters placed on them yet. Like, what if we asked them to teach us how it could be?
Yeah.
What if we turn around? This is what we think. What do you guys think? Like, I would be really interested in a school that did that and to see what kind of thoughts and kind of, you know, maybe ideas that you could start to test against. I think that would be an amazing education system.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for certain.
I mean, I don't know. Obviously, all this stuff, it's like in the ether sounds really cool, but
conceptually, I think people can grasp what we're not suggesting that, you know, we put some 5-year-olds in charge of the engineering department at MIT, but
or maybe we are.
Maybe you are.
I don't know. I mean, it's just, here's the thing is, again, like this is the one thing I just keep coming back to that is the only thing I can kind of find truth in, is that whatever I'm looking for, I can find. And that has been more true to me than anything else I can tangibly reason. And like, that is why, I mean, in the end, like, just choose wisely. Choose wisely what you're looking for. Choose wisely what kind of evidence you're trying to collect to prove this thing. And is this even the point you actually want to prove about your life? Like, do you actually want to keep finding evidence that you should be scared, you should be sad, you should be worried, you should be, you know, you're going to get sick? You're like, do you actually, is that the evidence you want to keep collecting? Or do you want to maybe perhaps start looking for evidence of a life that is beautiful and loving and supported and creative and impassioned? Like, what evidence do you want to collect?
Yeah. Again, fantastic advice, but different than if you're trying to determine, you know, how water sticks to the planet. It is. I mean, I get in theory it's tricky to deal with, but I think about the way you were raised, the way that your dad was with you. I mean, he was very much like this, very much interested in hearing hey, this is what we know. Well, specifically about religion. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, about religion, and like, obviously that was probably the thing you most learned from him, or like had open-ended discussions about things.
Well, it was the thing that was open, right? Yeah, so like religion was like a shit, I don't know, man. Here's a bunch of books that I've read, you know. But to contrast that, it was, well, if you want the corner of your house to be square, it's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is how you figure it out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so like, there's a juxtaposition there of like, there's things that are wide open, these things that are unknown and unknowable versus things that we know about the world.
I would
how to
say,
make a right triangle.
Yeah, I would say that mathematics is probably the one universal truth. And I think that is actually a language in which real truths exist. We may not understand all the formulas and we may not, but like, I think that, you know, I think that actually is a place in which we can probably find universul truths for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Perfect.
But what we do with those mathematics, but I mean,
no, it's true.
I think that's why like, there's actually this really cute Donald Duck video about math. Have you ever seen it?
I don't know.
It's like, it's actually brilliant because he's explaining like Pythagorean theorem and all these different like mathematical equations, but he's making them like really relatable and understandable for like a young mind.
Kind of like the oatmeal does with grammar.
Yeah, exactly. So I wish I knew like what it was called, but if you just Google Donald Duck math video or something like that, it's pretty amazing the way that he's explaining mathematics. And I do think that actually that might be one of the reasons that it's become so tricky for us to distill out information is that we've lost the language of mathematics, like in the way that it could be beneficial for us to understand, almost like we understand language or almost like the way we use language as a medium of communication. Right. I just don't think many of us have a universal grasp of mathematics as well. And I think that it could be a way that we communicate in a more interesting paradigm where things make more sense, quote unquote. Yeah.
Well, no, I think that is 100% correct. And I think if people are interested in diving into that, Brian Greene's new book, which is called Time, Out of Time.
Okay.
Something like that. Let me look it up real quick.
Okay.
Is absolutely fascinating in that I think he just does a really damn good job of kind of bridging that gap where you're talking about until the end of time.
Until the end. Okay.
Yeah. Until the end of time, mind, matter, and our search for meaning in an evolving universe.
I like it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the cool thing, right? Like there's so many people that are just bringing forth new, interesting ideas. And I mean, I think that is like getting back to your point, like this is what makes life interesting. It's what makes life illuminating, exciting, and like all of these, you know, whatever those words are for you.
Words.
Yeah. It makes it fun. And like the way that you decide to relate to it, it can either be more fun or less fun, but like if it's totally available to dive in and to accept like the mystery of all of this is cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
I don't know.
All right.
There's this, there is this math guy that I've been communicating forever with, trying to get him on the podcast. So I'm reinvigorating that conversation because he does
math.
No, but what's the other word I'm trying to think of?
Arithmetic?
No, it's like sacred geometry.
Oh,
yeah. Which, you know, is.
Oh, is he the Resonance Project guy?
No, he's
Somebody
not.
Else. Oh, right.
No.
Well, we won't have him on the podcast either.
Well, we hope you guys enjoyed this podcast.
Yeah, it's good. It's fun for me.
No, I love it. I mean, this is actually, to be fair, this is pretty much how it is to hang out with us. This is the kind of stuff we talk about. This is the kind of stuff that is just interesting. And I hope that you guys, you know, if it hopefully inspires you to just kind of open up the filter of your life a little more and just think about things in a way that is helpful to you. If it's not helpful to you, then, you know, close that filter back down.
Then stop it. Yeah. Don't hoard toilet paper. Be nice. Wash your hands. Wash your clothes. Don't sneeze on people. Just be cool.
Be cool. Stay calm. Keep looking for the things you want to find.
Yep. That's a fact.
We love you guys.
Love you. Bye.
Bye.